As the days grow darker and colder, the weather becomes wetter and the tree leaves turn red. During this time, more than any, humans start to tell scarier stories. This has been a human tradition for decades now. The biggest reason? Halloween. Now a fun holiday for dressing up and eating candy, its origin goes centuries back. Rooted in religious practice, October 31st is far more than scary movies and city costumes. Today we're going way back to the Celts and Romans. Then we're traveling back to the present to see how Christianity and movies changed it into the American holiday we all know and love. Well, I assume you all know and love it. I never celebrated it. So, grab a nice cup of cinnamon tea or pumpkin spice latte and let's get into the history of Halloween. It's a Celtic thing. That's often what you hear when you ask where Halloween comes from. That or that it's satanic, which we will get back to later, Marcus. The whole Celtic people are greatly addicted to religion. It's what Caesar said about it. The Celts got their name from the Greeks. They were first mentioned by Greek authors in 540 and 425 BC as Keltoi, Keltai, and Klalatai, and later were even more mentioned by the Romans as Kelti, Keltae, or Galli. The Romans actually came in contact a lot with the Celts as their empire was expanding. In that time, the Celts were an umbrella term for tribes with similar customs in Central to Northern Eastern Europe, and later they settled in England. Something I realized while researching this video is that Asterix and Obelix are Celts. I used to love these comics, cartoons and movies as a kid, so realizing that the Galli are the same as the Celts was pretty fun for me. Anyway, a lot of what we know about the early life of the Celts is a bit muddy. A lot of it comes from the Romans, who often wrote down or copied writings of events years after they happened. Also, the Celts were not just one tribe, they were multiple tribes, given the classification of Celt by the Romans, because of their customs and sometimes even language. And because of this, these Celtic tribes often have a somewhat mythical status, with their pagan customs and strange traditions, described by a people that really didn't know a lot about them. Fun fact, I'm from a country that was under Roman rule, which we don't look back on fondly. However, we had what some people classify as a Celtic tribe that fought against the Romans. And in history class, it was told as the Great Roman Empire couldn't cross into their territory, even though they were seen as at a disadvantage. It is played up as this amazing mythical thing. And even the Romans had texts about deities that fought on this tribe's side and helped them win. All of this to say that history cannot always be trusted fully. Even when things were documented amazingly, which in this case it was not, we have to keep in mind that lots of it is based in speculation. Customs and traditions did vary between Celtic regions and tribes. Nowadays, when you think about the Celts, you think about Britain. You think about the Irish or the Welsh. It is believed that the Celts arrived at the shore of Britain at approximately 1000 BC and lived there during the Iron Age, the Roman Age, and the post-Roman era. You still see their influences in the language, culture, and traditions today. So let's get into these Celtic traditions, because here the roots of Halloween lay. More specifically, the roots lay with one of the 4 fire festivals of the Celts that were celebrated around the year. The first one is Imbolc, celebrated around February 2nd. It is celebrated at the halfway point between winter, Jul Solis, and spring. It is the beginning of spring. The second, Beltane, celebrated on the first day of May, also called May Day, the beginning of summer. The third, Lammas, celebrated on the first day of August, is the celebration of the harvest. And lastly, and the one we will be focusing on today, is Samhain. Celebrated from October 31st to November 1st, this holiday marked the start of winter and the death of summer. And with it, it started the dark half of the year. On this night, the veil between the physical and spirit world breaks down, allowing the otherworldly to interact with humans. It is important to note that the word spirit does not only refer to deceased humans here, but also is another word for fairy or fee, which was a very big part of the Celtic beliefs. Who would cross from the other world into ours was debatable between the Celtic regions. In Britain, deceased family members would visit their old homes, and they would be welcomed. Food would be brought out for them, and kids would have to entertain them. In Ireland, however, people were afraid to leave their houses and would avoid graveyards on the night of Samhain. In Wales, food would be left out for the spirits, and in Scotland it was a night of mischief where the dead was impersonated by young men. In some regions, celebrations were organized by local kings or rulers. Samhain would start on sunset on October 31st after the workers returned from the fields. Everyone was supposed to participate in the celebrations, and those who did not risked death, either by the gods they offended by it, or in some cases even by governing bodies, some sources say. The main celebration was on the night of October 31st to November 1st, but some regions celebrate the 3 days before and after as well, and some texts suggest it was celebrated even longer, with heavy drinking for more than a week. Some documents also suggest that not every king or ruler held the celebrations once a year, but some would only celebrate it once every 3 or even 7 years. This, however, would not mean it was possible that in the missing years, people themselves did not celebrate it on smaller scales. So, what would people actually do during Samhain, which is known to date back at least 2000 years? As already suggested, the celebrations around it was filled with drinking and good food. It was a celebration of the new year and the end of the summer. Samhain also coincided with the end of warfare, mainly because of the approach of winter, but also because cattle would be brought inside, so raiding became less easy. Therefore, in some Celtic regions, not all, however, Samhain was seen as the feast of peace and friendship. But there was a dark side to it as well. As stated above, Samhain was the start of the dark half of the year, and it was believed that the veil between humans and the other world was the thinnest on this night, and thus the celebration also centered around appeasing the gods and fee. With the Irish Celts, pigs were seen as the sacrificial animal of Samhain, since Samhain onsets with the breeding seasons of the pigs, which last from November to January, so the young at the time were now all grown up. Other animals that might not make it through the winter were slaughtered and used at the feast as well. Druids would light fires on assigned hills, and it is believed that most offerings would take place here. These offerings would consist of cows, pigs, and sometimes even horses, but also grain, and it is speculated that most offerings were for the god Loch. Later, around the Middle Ages, these fires would be set closer to farms and villages, and be used as protection from the fee. Carved turnips would also appear around this time, strung up by a string. Later, when moving towards the States, pumpkin would be used for this. Samhain also coincided with tax season. Well, at least their version of it, where landowners would have to give up part of their harvest. Some tales use the offerings as a scapegoat for this. Irish myths talk about the tyrant Conans, who made the clan Nemet give up 1/3 of all their milk and grain for these offerings. It isn't strange that food seems to be the center of Samhain, since it fell at the turn of the season. The harvest had all been brought in, and it was time to slaughter animals for the winter. Breweries had enough produce to make cider and meat. People had enough food for markets and fairs, and to celebrate in that way. In some way, they had to, because they had to eat everything before it would go bad. Even though offerings were made, there was still a fear for the fee. Some people would dress up as animals to avoid being kidnapped by them. Some fee associated with Samhain are the Hooka, Lady Gwen, the Dullahan, and Sloch. At the end of these early celebrations, Druid would hold meetings to create rules that should be held up until the next Samhain. Aside from Samhain, there are some Roman traditions that have similarities to this, which are worth looking into since the Romans were in contact with the Celts, and these traditions could have very much influenced Samhain, and therefore our beloved Halloween. Okay, so the Romans, just like the Celts, had lots of celebrations as well, two of which have a few similarities with the Celtic Samhain. The first one was celebrated in February. It was called Feralia and was a festival about the spirits of the dead. During a 9-day celebration, people would leave offerings on the graves of their ancestors. While this festival itself is very different from Samhain, the Romans too did this to keep the residents of another world away, namely to keep their deceased relatives from entering the human world again. The second celebration was Lemuria, which was in May, while Feralia had a more light-hearted note. This celebration was all about keeping hauntings at bay from people who died violently. The whole month was seen as unlucky, and people would do special rites to get rid of these hauntings, one of which included throwing beans. So that was really short, the Roman traditions, and I do want to go into them deeper in a separate video. For now, we're gonna go from the Roman Empire to the Christian Empire, which was also the Roman Empire, but just a little bit later. With the Roman Empire also came the spread of Christianity to the Celts. Christians in the Roman army had evangelized to them already. However, widespread conversions didn't come until the later missionaries. This is when it was also decided to embrace the pagan celebrations and places of worship, as long as they were changed into the Christian mold. Lots of old Celtic celebrations began to become celebrations for saints, or even the Son of God. Think about Christmas, for example. That's a story for another day. Celebrations like the fire festivals turned into days for saints and temples into churches. It was Pope Gregory IV who suggested this to missionaries, and with it started a wave of what I call the Christianifying of Europe. Samhain also got a makeover by Pope Greg IV, who made it All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day was originally celebrated on May 13, but in 837 Pope Gregory IV moved it to November 1st. All Saints' Day is a day Catholics celebrate all the saints, logically, even the ones only known to God. According to Catholic Online, this holiday is a mandatory holiday to attend Mass, and in some countries it is even a public holiday, so we can assume it's quite an important holiday for the Catholics. November 2nd was turned into All Souls' Day, a remembrance day for the deceased. These two holidays had little in common with Samhain. We find more of its history in All Hallows' Eve, that is celebrated on October 31st. Here Christians would embrace the traditions of the pagans, and a lot of the traditions we can find in Halloween today originated from this time period. So let's look into these traditions, shall we? Hi, I'm a human. I write, record, draw assets and edit this video all by myself. No AI involved here. If you want to support my human activities, consider subscribing and liking this video. I will be forever grateful. And remember, a human thanks is worth way more than a robot thanks. I'm not entirely sure apple bopping isn't just some quirky thing Hollywood made up Americans do, because I've never personally seen or heard someone talk about it. But from my research, it seems to be that apple bopping originated actually as a way of courtship. Apples have often been a sign of fertility and prosperity in European mythology. Indun, in Norse mythology, holds apples of eternal youth and health, and for the Celtic, Lugh, one of the most important gods, was often depicted holding 3 apples. In Greek mythology, Aphrodite, goddess of love and also fertility, is claimed to be the most beautiful goddess by being given a golden apple. The significance of apples was quite big in Europe, and thus also for the Celts. And given that apples were harvested around Samhain and later Hallows' Eve, it is no surprise that the traditions surrounding it formed. Apples were used to tell fortune, and one way young women would get to know about their love lives was by secretly marking one apple and putting them with the apples in a tub to be bopped. If a girl's potential lover was able to grab the apple with his teeth, the relationship would blossom. Later, it was these early European colonists who also brought the apple to America by bringing with them apple seeds, thus bringing the tradition with them overseas as well. Other fun rituals to do with love were in Ireland. People would choose between small cakes named Byron Brack, which had either a ring or a nut in it. If you had a cake with a ring, you would marry that year, and if not, you would stay single. It was also said that sewing was the most favorable time to get pregnant. In Wales, however, there was a ritual where you would stay in the church porch until midnight, and then you would hear the names of the people that would die that year, including even maybe your own. These rituals, however, did not make it to the New World. Jack-o'-lanterns began appearing in the early Middle Ages during Samhain. The most mainstream belief of where the practice of carving jack-o'-lanterns has come from is the Irish folktale of Stingy Jack. The story goes that a man named Jack who tricked the devil 1 to up to 3 times, depending on the rendition. Here is one of the renditions. First, when he went out to drink with the devil, he didn't want to pay. So the devil turned himself into a coin so Jack could pay. But instead, Jack put a coin in his pocket next to a silver coin with a cross on it, thus trapping the devil. He only let the devil free after the beast promised to not bother him for a year, and not claim his soul once he died. The year after, when the devil visited him again, Jack tricked him to climb up a tree, and trapped him there by carving a cross at the bottom of it. He only let the devil out when he promised not to bother him for 10 years. Soon after Jack died, God wouldn't let him into heaven due to him being a terrible person. So Jack went to his friends for help, the devil. However, the devil remembered how Jack had tricked him twice, and didn't want to help him. And, of course, he held up his promise to not claim Jack's soul. Instead, the devil let him roam the earth, with only a burning piece of coal which Jack put in a carved out turnip. People began to carve out their own turnips and put them by the door to scare off Jack or other thief. Irish immigrants took this tradition with them to the New World, where the turnip was replaced by a pumpkin, since that grew in that climate and was easier to carve. This was not the only way the term jack-o'-lantern was used. In 17th century Britain, the term was used for night watchman. Jack was often used to identify a man you didn't know the name of, kind of like we use guy right now, while o-lantern means of the lantern. Night watchmen used to, of course, walk around at night with lanterns, thus they were men of the lantern. In 1832, the term got a third meaning. It was used in a newspaper where it referred to a fire coming from gas from decomposing organic materials that spontaneously caught fire, which is not uncommon to happen in certain areas. Although a staple and the reason why Halloween's most kids' favorite holiday, giving out candy wasn't popularized until the 1920s and 30s, and only became a widely known practice in the 1950s when the economy allowed it to spread. In the 50s, candy companies also started to cater to the holiday. Before it, kids would get cookies, apples, hazelnuts, or coins. The origin most likely came from the older days of Samhain, where the Celtic people would leave out treats for the spirits. When the day became All Hallows Eve, people instead would bake soul cakes. These cakes would be given out to children and the poor. These traditions were brought with immigrants to America and influenced the first people going door to door, which candy companies later saw as a great opportunity to capitalize on. The candy scares of the 70s. However, this going door to door was not always seen as something innocent and fun. It could be scary as well. Have you ever heard of people putting drugs in pixie sticks and razors in candy bars or apples? This fear originated in the 70s, when the New York Times suggested that the trick-or-treat tradition might be used by people to poison kids. These fears were only amplified when 2 days later it was reported that a boy had died due to heroin, which his uncle had claimed had been in the boy's Halloween candy. However, it was later revealed that the boy had found heroin in the uncle's house, and the uncle had only been looking for escape points to point to, which he had found in the Halloween candy. Sadly, the excuse of strangers putting drugs in kids' candy has been used more than once by neglectful and sometimes even malevolent guardians. It was October 31st, 1974. Ronald O'Brien gave out 5 pixie sticks that Halloween night. one to each of his 2 kids, and 3 to unrelated children. His 8-year-old son, Timothy, had eaten one, remarking that it tasted bitter and throwing up not soon after. An hour later, boy had died, poisoned by cyanide that was in the pixie stick. The father claimed the boy had gotten the candy from a house and acted shocked, even giving an emotional speech at the boy's funeral. Thank God, none of the other kids had eaten the candy and were warned before another disaster had hit. O'Brien became a suspect when the police found out that he put out life insurance policies on both of his children, Timothy and his little sister. The man was in a lot of debt, and the insurance payout would have paid it all off. Later, when they interviewed his wife, they also found out that he tried a similar scheme by setting a house on fire that he also had put insurance on.
He had taken out the insurance on his children, and the deal with the bank. And she just said, oh my God, I was afraid of this. I knew something was, she said, I knew something was wrong. And at that time, she related several stories to me about things that O'Brien had done in the past that were fraudulent to collect money.
O'Brien maintained his innocence till the end. He was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to death in the end. I'm pretty sure that Halloween every parent in the county was throwing out the pixie sticks. Some might have even thrown out all of their kids' Halloween candy. It is an absolute awful story that a man would kill his own children and even endanger others to get a quick payout. The story spread quickly through America, and the poison candy scare got even worse when Newsweek magazine asserted in 1975 that over the past several years, several children had died and hundreds had narrowly escaped injuries from razor blades, sewing needles, and shards of glass that was put in their goodies by adults, even though there was no evidence for this. By the 1980s, a lot of households had banned trick-or-treating, and some hospitals even offered some X-ray candy to make sure that there weren't any razors hidden in it. Bills were signed to put a jail sentence on any people who tampered with candy, which sounds very reasonable. Why wasn't that there in the first place? Contrary to popular belief, though, in 1985, a study was published that could not find any confirmed deaths led by strangers giving out Halloween candy with drugs or poison or razors in them. Sociologist Joel Best at the University of Delaware, who had worked on the study, called it an urban legend. In these days, it is indeed seen as a more urban legend than a genuine scare. I'm sure there are still parents who inspect the candy of their kids, but I highly doubt they ever found something. As I already said in the chapter about Samhain, some people would dress up as animals to avoid the fee. This tradition developed in the Middle Ages with Hallows Eve, where people would dress up to receive soul cakes, but also people would dress up to trick and play pranks on people. This was a Scottish tradition, where men would dress up to impersonate the ghost, and sometimes even cross-dressed. When Irish immigrants brought these traditions to the States, it quickly caught on. In those early days, anonymity was a large part of the costumes. A lot of older costumes have these slightly uncanny homemade masks. And in the 1920s and 1930s, Halloween masquerades began to get popular for both kids and adults. These decades also saw the beginning of licensed costumes. The J. Halpern Company began making costumes of, at the time, popular characters like Popeye, Mickey Mouse, and Olive Oyl. Is that her name? Okay. But you also had the classic costumes like pirates or homeless people. Wait, what? Homeless people? After World War II, with the rise of pop culture, costumes began to look more like the ones we have today. Superheroes, film characters, cowboys, but also instead of making costumes at home, it became more and more normalized to buy them at stores. As the economy grew and companies saw this as a way to capitalize on the holiday, just like the candy manufacturers did, costumes also became more fun than scary. Although the scary costumes still had a place in the holiday, especially when the classic horror movies were made. Now, I don't live in the States, but I feel like with how it's represented in the media and what I hear from it, parties and dressing up is the biggest part of Halloween for when you're in your adolescence and young adulthood. Like even in my country that originally didn't celebrate Halloween, you now see Halloween parties pop off. There's one thing, however, that is bigger for kids and teens, and that is trick-or-treating. We've already talked a bit about the candy part, but tricking also is something that has belonged to Halloween since Samhain. Remember when I said that Scottish youth would dress up and pretend they were spirits? Well, they terrorized towns doing that. Wouldn't you, if the next day you could just blame it on spirits? Combine this with the anonymity of a costume. And of course, teens today still do it. With the parties and dressing up of the 1930s also came the pranks that sometimes amounted to riots, broken fences, vandalized houses, etc. A custom would likely have played a role in this, as the newspapers would make you believe. I'm thinking that alcohol would also not have helped. And these riots were seen as a Halloween problem. Trick or treat was what the Celts thought would happen if you didn't lay out the sweets for spirits or give soul cakes out to the poor. It would result in bad luck. And I guess it is still true today. You give out shit candy, you reap the consequences. Or at least that is what Hollywood made me believe. Halloween is a perfect example of how traditions can survive for centuries. Yes, they may shift and the context may change, but it is still a reminder of what once was. I didn't really mention it, but there are people who celebrate Samhain again. They go back to the roots and instead of trick-or-treating, they celebrate Samhain by having a feast for family and friends, past and present. In that way, they also celebrate the harvest. And I think that's nice. Anyway, I think I waffled on long enough. This was a deep dive into the history of Halloween, from someone who never celebrated it. So, I hope you enjoyed this. I didn't go too much into the presents, so comment down below what you do for Halloween. Any fun traditions? I myself watch The Nightmare Before Christmas every November 1st, because it's not a Halloween movie, but also not a Christmas movie. It's a strange mix of both. So, a November 1st watch seems appropriate. I really like Halloween, not so much as a holiday, but as an aspect of Western culture. It has such deep roots, but also so many obscure urban legends and aspects. Because of that, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do for my first Halloween video. I love the small and obscure things, but I thought this would be more appropriate. So now we all have a good base understanding about where Halloween came from and what it entails. And then, in the following years, I can look into the more weird, strange, little things. But first, I have to focus on next month's video. As you might have noticed, I privated my last video. There were some audio issues, so I have to record the voiceover again. I hope to put that one back up in November, and then have a shorter video for the next month as well. And then it's December already. Christmas, New Year's. I have to see what I do for that. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and happy Celtic New Year, I guess. Bye.